A town will show you its true soul the moment it finds someone weaker to laugh at. The noon sun hung over Red Hollow like a branding iron, baking the dust until the streets smelled of dirt, leather, and horse sweat. Men crowded outside Mercer's saloon with whiskey glasses in their hands while wagon wheels creaked slowly past the general store. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang once, thin and lonely against the dry western wind. Samuel Whitaker kept his eyes down as he crossed the street with a feed sack hanging over one shoulder. The sack was too heavy for his narrow frame, but he carried it anyway, dragging his bad leg through the dirt one uneven step at a time. Every few feet, the wooden crutch under his arm sank into the loose ground with a dull crack. Some folks turned away when they saw him coming. Others stared openly. In Red Hollow, pity never lasted long. It always turned into cruelty once boredom settled in. "Look alive," Clyde Mercer called from the saloon porch, his voice smooth with amusement. "The king of cripples is making his grand parade again." Laughter rolled through the crowd. Sam kept walking. He had learned years ago that silence survived longer than anger. Clyde stepped down from the porch, boots thudding softly against the packed earth. He was broad across the shoulders, clean-shaven, wearing a silver watch chain that flashed in the sunlight every time he moved. Men like Clyde always looked polished out here. The West rewarded confidence, even when it came wrapped around ugliness. "Heard you been hiding something, boy," Clyde said. Sam tightened his grip on the feed sack. "Ain't hiding anything." "That so?" Clyde circled him slowly while the crowd leaned closer. "Then why'd Sheriff Price find Apache markings burned near your barn last week?" A nervous murmur moved through the street. The word Apache carried weight in these parts. Fear. Old stories. Bad memories passed down around campfires. Sam swallowed hard but said nothing. Clyde smiled wider when he saw it. "Thought so." Then, before Sam could shift his balance, Clyde hooked the bottom of the crutch lightly with his boot. It wasn't hard. Didn't need to be. Sam lost his footing immediately. The feed sack burst open as he crashed into the dirt, grain spilling across the street like yellow rain. Laughter exploded around him. Sharp. Ugly. Endless. Someone tossed a coin near his hand. "Dance for it," a man shouted. Another coin landed beside his shoulder. Sam stayed on one knee, breathing slowly through the humiliation while dust clung to his palms. He could feel every eye in town pressing down on him. Children snickering behind barrels. Women whispering behind gloved hands. Even Sheriff Nolan Price stood near the jailhouse pretending not to notice. Clyde crouched beside him. "You know what your problem is, Samuel?" he asked softly. "You keep acting like you belong here." More laughter followed. But then something changed. At first it was only a vibration beneath the dirt. Barely noticeable. A low tremor running through the street boards and wagon wheels. The laughter faded little by little as heads began turning west. Beyond the edge of town, past the dry hills glowing red beneath the afternoon sun, a wall of dust was rising into the sky. Horses. Dozens of them. No. Hundreds. The sound came next. Hooves. Slow. Heavy. Steady enough to make the whiskey glasses tremble against the saloon railing. Sheriff Price straightened instantly, his face draining pale. Clyde's smile disappeared. And Samuel Whitaker, still kneeling in the dirt beside the spilled grain, closed his eyes the moment he saw the riders coming through the dust. The riders came out of the dust like shadows crossing the face of the desert. Long lines of horses moved in perfect silence beneath the burning Arizona sun, their shapes growing clearer with every second. Leather straps creaked softly. Feathers stirred in the dry wind. Rifle scabbards knocked against saddles in slow rhythm with the horses' steps. Nobody in Red Hollow spoke anymore. Even the piano inside Mercer's saloon had gone silent. Samuel Whitaker pushed himself upright with shaking hands while grain stuck to the sweat on his shirt. His broken crutch lay half buried in the dirt beside him, but he barely looked at it. His eyes stayed fixed on the riders approaching town. Sheriff Nolan Price stepped into the middle of the street, one trembling hand resting near his holster. "Everybody inside," he ordered, though his voice lacked the strength of a real command. Folks obeyed anyway. Doors slammed shut up and down the street. Curtains moved behind windows. Mothers pulled children indoors so fast the little ones barely had time to ask questions. Only Clyde Mercer remained outside beside the saloon porch, though the confidence from earlier had drained from his face. "This is because of him," somebody whispered from a nearby doorway. Another voice answered immediately. "I told you the cripple was hiding something." The fear spread faster than wildfire through dry grass. Apache riders did not travel in numbers like this without reason. Not 200 men. Not this organized. Not this quiet. That was the part unsettling everyone most. Silence. No war cries. No threats. Just the steady sound of hooves rolling closer over the earth. Samuel felt his chest tighten as memories pushed at the back of his mind. Snow falling through black pine trees. The smell of smoke and wet fur. A small boy shivering beneath a torn blanket. Sam forced the memories down before they could fully surface. Now was not the time. The lead riders entered town first. Tall men with weathered faces and dark braids streaked with silver. Their horses looked powerful and calm beneath them, trained for distance and hardship. Behind them stretched row after row of riders disappearing back into the dust cloud outside town. It looked less like a war party and more like a moving wall of history. Then Samuel saw him. The old chief rode at the front on a gray horse scarred across the neck. He wore no grand headdress, no bright colors, no ornaments meant for show. Just dark buckskin, worn gloves, and eyes colder than mountain stone. Those eyes swept slowly across Red Hollow. The saloon. The church. The sheriff. The frightened faces watching from windows. Then they stopped on Samuel. Completely still. Sheriff Price swallowed hard. "What business do you have here?" he called out. The old chief did not answer immediately. He dismounted with calm precision, boots touching the dirt so softly it almost sounded respectful. Every rider behind him stopped moving at the exact same moment. Hundreds of horses. Hundreds of men. Silent. Watching. The chief took several slow steps forward until he stood in the center of town. Dust drifted around him in thin ribbons beneath the afternoon light. Clyde Mercer tried to laugh, but the sound came out weak. "If you are looking for trouble," he said, "you found the wrong town." The chief ignored him completely. Instead, he looked directly at Samuel Whitaker and spoke in a low steady voice that carried through the entire street. "3 winters ago," he said, "a boy disappeared during a storm near Black Creek." Samuel felt the blood leave his face. Sheriff Price frowned. "What does that have to do with us?" The chief's expression never changed. "We followed his trail for 3 years," he said quietly. "And every trail led here." The wind moved strangely through Red Hollow after the chief spoke those words. Like the whole town had forgotten how to breathe at the same time. Samuel Whitaker stood motionless in the dirt while the old memories he had buried for 3 long years began clawing their way back into the light. Snow. Endless snow. Black Creek buried beneath winter ice. The sharp smell of pine sap and smoke drifting through frozen air. Back then, Samuel had been smaller. Thinner. Still limping from the fever that ruined his leg when he was a child. Most folks in town barely noticed him unless they needed stable work done cheap. He slept above the feed barn behind Martha Bell's boarding house, wrapped in old quilts that smelled like dust and cedar. Winter in Arizona could fool people who had never lived through one. The days stayed dry enough, but the nights cut through bone once the mountain winds rolled down from the north. 3 winters ago, one of those storms arrived early. Samuel remembered hearing coyotes somewhere beyond town as snow dusted the rooftops silver beneath moonlight. He had been carrying water buckets back from the well when he noticed tracks crossing the edge of Black Creek. Small tracks, barely visible beneath fresh snow. At first he thought they belonged to a stray calf. Then he saw drops of blood scattered beside them. Tiny drops, close together, like whoever left them was stumbling. Samuel should have turned back. Everybody knew the stories about Apache territory north of the creek. Men disappeared there sometimes. Wagons too. Sheriff Price always warned folks not to wander after sunset. But there had been something about those tracks that stayed with him. Maybe because they looked lonely. Maybe because he understood what it felt like to struggle while the world kept walking past you. He followed the trail into the trees with nothing except a lantern and his old wool coat. Snow crunched beneath his boots while the wind pushed freezing air through the pines. About half a mile from the creek, he found the boy collapsed beneath a fallen cedar branch. The child could not have been older than 10. Dark braided hair. Thin shoulders shaking from cold. One sleeve stained with blood where the skin had scraped badly against rock or ice. Samuel remembered the fear in the boy's eyes most of all. Not fear of dying. Fear of being found. The boy tried to crawl backward through the snow when Samuel approached. "Easy," Samuel whispered, kneeling carefully despite the pain in his bad leg. "I am not going to hurt you." The child stared silently, breathing hard through cracked lips. Around his neck hung a leather cord threaded with small turquoise beads darkened by snow. Samuel recognized enough Apache markings to understand the boy came from one of the northern tribes. Trouble. Real trouble. Yet the child looked less like a warrior and more like somebody forgotten by the world. Samuel slowly removed his coat and wrapped it around the boy's shoulders. The child flinched at first, then stopped resisting once the warmth settled in. Snow continued falling through the trees around them while darkness swallowed the forest deeper by the minute. "Can you walk?" Samuel asked softly. The boy shook his head. Somewhere far off in the mountains, a horse whinnied through the wind. Samuel's stomach tightened immediately. Riders. Searching. The boy heard it too because fear flashed across his face again. Then, for the first time, he spoke. Just one sentence. Quiet enough to nearly disappear beneath the storm. "If they find me," he whispered, "they will sell me." Samuel never forgot those words. Not even once. Samuel had spent most of his life being treated like a burden, but that night inside the storm, somebody else looked even more afraid than he was. Snow covered the boy's hair and shoulders while the wind howled through the pine trees hard enough to bend branches sideways. Samuel could barely feel his own fingers anymore, yet he still pulled the child closer beneath the wool coat. The boy flinched every time distant horse sounds echoed through the mountains. Whoever he feared, it was not the cold. Samuel glanced toward the darkness beyond the trees. The riders sounded closer now. Slow. Searching carefully. Lantern light flickered somewhere through the storm like floating fireflies trapped inside the snow. "Come on," Samuel whispered. "We cannot stay out here." The boy hesitated before finally nodding once. Samuel slipped one arm beneath his shoulders and helped him stand. The child winced immediately, nearly collapsing as weight touched his injured ankle. Samuel tightened his grip without complaint. Together they moved through the forest one painful step at a time while snow thickened around them. It took nearly 40 minutes to reach the old feed barn behind Martha Bell's boarding house. By then, Samuel's bad leg burned like fire beneath his trousers. Every step felt heavier than the last. But he kept going because the child beside him had stopped shivering. That scared him more than anything. The barn smelled of hay, horses, and cedar oil from the lantern hanging near the back wall. Samuel settled the boy carefully into a pile of blankets above the stalls while the storm rattled the roof overhead. For several minutes neither of them spoke. The boy watched every movement cautiously, dark eyes sharp despite exhaustion. Samuel poured warm water from an iron kettle and handed over a dented tin cup. "Drink slow," he said softly. The child wrapped both hands around the cup but did not drink immediately. "Why are you helping me?" he finally asked. Samuel shrugged faintly. "Nobody helped me much growing up. Figured maybe I should try being different." The boy stared at him a long moment after that. Then he drank. Outside, horses suddenly approached the boarding house. Samuel froze instantly. Voices drifted through the storm below. Men. At least 3 of them. One laughed loudly enough to cut through the wind. Samuel moved toward the loft window and carefully peeked through the wooden slats. 3 riders sat outside Martha Bell's porch carrying rifles across their saddles. One of them wore a gray buffalo coat lined with expensive fur. Samuel recognized him immediately. Wade Garrison. A trader from Tucson with a smile that always looked false. Martha opened the boarding house door slightly, lantern light spilling across the snow. "Evening, gentlemen," she called cautiously. Wade removed his hat. "Looking for an Apache boy," he said. "Young. Injured. About 10 years old." Samuel felt the child behind him stop breathing. "Never seen one," Martha answered without hesitation. Wade smiled thinly. "If you do, there is $50 waiting for anybody willing to point us the right direction." $50. Enough money to feed some families through winter. Samuel looked down at the boy clutching the tin cup with trembling fingers. Suddenly everything made sense. Not soldiers. Hunters. The child had not escaped a battle. He had escaped being sold like property. One of the riders glanced toward the barn. "What about over there?" he asked. Samuel's heartbeat slammed hard against his ribs. Martha stepped directly into their line of sight before they could move. "Only horses and a crippled stable boy," she said coldly. "Unless you men plan on paying my feed bill, I suggest you leave my property." Silence stretched for several long seconds beneath the falling snow. Then Wade laughed quietly and tipped his hat back onto his head. "Fine," he said. "But if the boy shows himself, you send word." The riders turned slowly and disappeared back into the storm. Samuel stayed frozen at the loft window until the hoofbeats vanished completely. Then he looked back at the child wrapped in blankets beside the lantern light. The boy had tears standing silently in his eyes. "You should have let them take me," he whispered. Samuel shook his head once. "No," he said quietly. "I do not think I should have." The storm lasted 3 days. By the second night, snow had buried half the barn doors and frozen the water barrels solid beneath the moonlight. Samuel barely slept. Every few hours he climbed down from the loft to check the horses or add wood to the iron stove Martha Bell had dragged across the yard for them. The Apache boy stayed hidden beneath blankets near the back wall, quiet as falling ash. Sometimes Samuel caught him staring toward the storm outside with an expression too old for a child. Like he expected danger to come walking through the snow at any moment. On the morning of the 3rd day, the fever finally broke. Samuel noticed it first when the boy reached for water without his hands shaking. Sunlight pushed weakly through the barn cracks, turning the floating dust gold in the cold air. For the first time since Samuel found him near Black Creek, the child looked less frightened. "What is your name?" Samuel asked while handing over a piece of bread. The boy hesitated before answering. "Nantan." Samuel nodded once. "I am Samuel." "I know," the boy said quietly. That surprised him. "How?" Nantan glanced toward the stable doors where wine still rattled the hinges softly. "People in town talk about you." Samuel laughed under his breath. Not usually kindly. No, the boy admitted. But my grandfather says cruel people always speak loudest. Samuel looked over sharply. Your grandfather? Nantan nodded slowly. Chief Takoda. The name hit the barn harder than the winter wind. Even Samuel had heard stories about Takoda growing up. Apache leader. Negotiator. Survivor. Some folks called him dangerous. Others called him honorable. Depends who was telling the story. Samuel stared at the boy sitting beneath the blankets and suddenly saw details he had missed before. The turquoise beads around his neck. The careful stitching along his sleeves. The way he carried himself despite fear. This was no ordinary runaway child. Before Samuel could speak again, hoofbeats echoed faintly outside the barn. Both of them froze instantly. Samuel limped toward the window and carefully peered through the frost-covered slats. Wade. Garrison had returned. This time with more riders. 5 men sat outside the boarding house beneath the pale winter sky while Martha Bell stood blocking the porch steps with her shotgun resting against one shoulder. Wade looked irritated now. Impatient. The storm cleared, he called toward her. Tracks will show soon enough. Save everybody trouble and hand over the boy. Martha spat directly into the snow. You are standing on my property, she said. That already counts as trouble. One of the riders laughed, but Wade did not. His eyes drifted toward the barn again. Samuel stepped back from the window immediately. Nantan had already risen to his feet despite the injured ankle. I should leave, the boy whispered. Samuel shook his head. You cannot even walk straight yet. If they find me here, they will punish you. Samuel looked down at his twisted leg for a long moment before answering. Son, this town punished me long before you arrived. Silence settled between them. Outside, the horses shifted impatiently in the snow while wind carried pieces of conversation through the barn walls. Then came another sound. Faint at first. So distant Samuel nearly missed it. More horses. Not 5 this time. Many. Martha heard them too because her posture changed instantly on the porch. Wade slowly turned toward the northern hills. Every rider in the yard went quiet. Through the thin gray light of morning, dark shapes began appearing high along the snow-covered ridge beyond town. One rider. Then another. Then dozens more emerging soundlessly from the trees like spirits crossing the mountain. Wade Garrison's face lost all color. Nantan stepped beside Samuel at the window, eyes fixed on the ridge. For the first time since Samuel met him, the boy smiled. My people found me, he whispered. The riders reached Red Hollow before noon. Snow still covered the rooftops and fences in uneven patches, but the storm clouds had finally broken apart, leaving the mountains sharp and bright beneath the winter sun. Samuel stood near the barn doors beside Nantan while the sound of approaching horses rolled across the valley like distant thunder. Townspeople slowly emerged from homes and shops. One by one, drawn by fear stronger than caution. Nobody spoke loudly anymore. Even Clyde Mercer kept his voice low as he stepped onto the saloon porch beside Sheriff Price. The first Apache riders entered town in complete silence. Their horses moved calmly through the muddy street while snow melted from leather reins and dark wool blankets. Some carried rifles across their backs. Others wore long coats stitched with beadwork dulled by years of weather and travel. None of them looked left or right as they passed the buildings. They rode with the steady confidence of men who did not need to prove anything. Wade Garrison backed his horse several feet away from the boarding house the moment he saw them. Samuel noticed something strange then. Wade was afraid. Not nervous. Not cautious. Afraid. Chief Takoda appeared last, riding slowly down the center of the street on the same scarred gray horse Samuel had seen years later in Red Hollow. Time suddenly folded together inside Samuel's chest. The storm. The barn. The frightened child wrapped in blankets. And now this old man returning with half the mountain behind him. Takoda stopped directly in front of Martha Bell's porch and looked toward Nantan. The boy stepped forward carefully despite his injured ankle. For one long second neither of them moved. Then the chief climbed down from his horse and placed both hands against the boy's shoulders. No tears. No dramatic words. Just relief so heavy it settled over the whole street like another snowfall. The riders behind him lowered their heads quietly. Samuel had never seen anything like it before. Takoda studied Nantan's face carefully. "Were you harmed?" he asked in Apache. Nantan shook his head once before glancing toward Samuel. The chief followed the boy's eyes. Slowly, he turned toward the stable hand standing near the barn doors with one hand resting against his crooked leg. Samuel suddenly felt every eye in town land on him at once. Takoda walked forward through the muddy street without hurry. Sheriff Price shifted nervously beside the saloon. Clyde Mercer muttered something under his breath. Wade Garrison looked ready to disappear entirely. The old chief stopped a few feet from Samuel and studied him in silence. Close now, Samuel could see deep weather lines carved into the man's face from years beneath desert wind and sunlight. Takoda's eyes moved briefly to the broken crutch leaning beside the barn wall. Then to Samuel's hands roughened by stable work. Finally, to the old leather cord still hanging around Samuel's neck beneath his coat. The turquoise beads caught sunlight faintly as the wind stirred his collar open. Takoda's expression changed instantly. Not surprise. Recognition. The chief reached slowly beneath his own coat and removed an almost identical cord from around his neck. A quiet murmur spread through the riders behind him. Samuel looked down at the beads resting against his chest. "The boy gave it to me," he said softly. Takoda nodded once. "No," he answered. "He entrusted it to you." Silence swallowed the street again. Even the horses seemed still now. Takoda lifted his gaze toward Wade Garrison standing pale beside his horse. "You hunted a child through winter mountains," the chief said calmly. Wade tried to force a smile. "Now hold on. There has been some misunderstanding here." Takoda ignored him completely. Instead, he turned back toward Samuel. 3 winters ago, he said quietly enough that everyone strained to hear, "You carried my grandson through a storm that should have taken both your lives." Samuel swallowed hard. "I just helped somebody who needed it." Takoda's eyes softened for the first time. "That," he said, "is why we crossed 200 miles to find you." The cold air hanging over Red Hollow felt different after those words. Not warmer. Heavier. Like the town itself suddenly understood it had witnessed something it could never take back. Samuel Whitaker stood frozen beside the barn while 200 Apache riders watched him with complete silence. 3 hours earlier, men had laughed while he crawled through spilled grain searching for his broken crutch. Now nobody dared make a sound. Clyde Mercer shifted uneasily on the saloon porch, his boots scraping against old wood. "This is getting carried away," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. Sheriff Nolan Price shot him a warning glance, but Clyde kept talking anyway. Men like him always did. "The boy did one good deed," Clyde said louder. "That does not make him family to a tribe." Several riders turned their eyes toward him at once. Not angry. Worse than angry. Calm. Takoda slowly faced the saloon porch while wind tugged at the edges of his dark coat. "Family is not decided by blood alone," the chief said quietly. "Sometimes it is decided by who stands beside you when the world turns cold." The street fell silent again. Samuel lowered his eyes, uncomfortable beneath the attention pressing down from every direction. He had spent so many years being invisible that being seen now felt almost painful. Nantan stepped closer beside him. Taller than before. Stronger too. The frightened child Samuel once carried through a snowstorm had nearly grown into a man. Yet when he looked at Samuel, the gratitude in his eyes remained exactly the same. "You gave me your own blanket that night," Nantan said softly. "You barely stopped shaking by morning." Samuel shrugged awkwardly. "You needed it more." Nantan smiled faintly. "That is what my grandfather said you would answer." A few townspeople exchanged uneasy glances nearby. Martha Bell stood quietly on her porch with one hand against the shotgun resting beside the doorway. She looked proud. Not surprised. Like somewhere deep down, she had expected this moment all along. Wade Garrison, however, looked trapped. His horse shifted nervously beneath him while sweat gathered along his collar despite the cold air. Takoda turned toward him once more. "You hunted a child for money," the chief said. Wade lifted both hands slightly. "Now wait just a minute. I never harmed the boy." "No," Takoda agreed. "You only placed a price on his life." Wade opened his mouth again, but the words died there. Because every rider behind Takoda had begun staring directly at him now. Not threatening. Not reaching for weapons. Simply watching. The weight of that silence crushed whatever confidence he had left. Sheriff Price finally stepped forward, clearing his throat awkwardly. "Chief Takoda," he said carefully, "perhaps everybody ought to settle this peacefully." Takoda looked at him with unreadable eyes. "Peacefully," he repeated. "Your town mocked the one man who showed mercy when others showed greed." Price lowered his gaze immediately. Samuel noticed something then that unsettled him more than anger ever could. Shame. Not just in the sheriff. In nearly everyone watching. The woman who had tossed coins into the dirt earlier refused to meet his eyes now. A blacksmith standing near the feed store quietly removed his hat. Even Clyde Mercer no longer looked certain of himself. Takoda stepped closer to Samuel until only a few feet separated them. Slowly, the old chief reached beneath his coat and removed a folded bundle wrapped carefully in deer hide. He offered it forward with both hands. Samuel hesitated before accepting it. Inside rested a beautifully carved knife sheath stitched with turquoise beads matching the cord around his neck. Empty. No blade inside. Samuel frowned slightly. Takoda noticed. "Among my people," the chief explained softly, "an empty sheath means trust. It means the hand carrying it has no need to prove strength." Samuel looked down at the beadwork glimmering faintly beneath winter sunlight. His rough fingers trembled against the leather. Nobody had ever given him something made with care before. Not once in his life. Takoda's next words came so quietly the whole town leaned forward to hear them. 3 winters ago, he said, you treated my grandson like a human being while others hunted him like an animal. The chief placed one weathered hand against Samuel's shoulder. That debt does not disappear with time. Snow melted slowly along the edges of Red Hollow as afternoon light stretched across the street in long golden bands. Nobody moved much anymore. The town that usually echoed with wagon wheels, laughter, and whiskey songs had become quieter than a churchyard. 200 Apache riders remained mounted in complete silence while Samuel Whitaker stood near the barn holding the empty knife sheath carefully in both hands. He could still feel the warmth from Takoda's hand resting against his shoulder moments earlier. It had been years since anyone touched him with kindness instead of pity. Clyde Mercer finally stepped down from the saloon porch, though the swagger that once followed him like perfume had disappeared completely. He stopped several feet away from Samuel and cleared his throat awkwardly. "Boy," he muttered, avoiding eye contact, "seems there are things we did not know." Samuel looked at him quietly. The bruises from his fall earlier still darkened one side of his face. Grain dust clung to his coat sleeves. Nothing about him had changed since morning except the way people looked at him now. Clyde shifted uncomfortably beneath the silence. "I was only joking before," he added weakly. Samuel glanced toward the muddy street where the broken pieces of his crutch still lay half buried near the saloon porch. Then he looked back at Clyde. "Funny thing about jokes," he said softly. "The person laughing usually is not the one getting hurt." Clyde lowered his eyes immediately. Takoda watched the exchange without speaking. The old chief understood something most people in Red Hollow never had. Shame did more work than anger ever could. Near the boarding house, Martha Bell wiped her hands slowly against her apron while watching Samuel with tired gentle eyes. "Told this town years ago the boy had more decency than all of you put together," she muttered under her breath. Sheriff Price heard her and looked away. Nantan stepped toward Samuel carrying something wrapped carefully in dark cloth. Snow dripped steadily from the barn roof behind him while horses breathed clouds of steam into the cold air. The young Apache stopped directly in front of Samuel before unfolding the cloth with both hands. Inside rested a beautifully carved wooden crutch polished smooth as river stone. Silver markings curved along the sides beside small turquoise beads woven carefully through leather straps near the top. Samuel stared at it speechlessly. "My grandfather made that during the second winter after I returned home," Nantan said quietly. "He said someday we would find the man who carried me through the storm." Takoda nodded once. "A chief remembers debts," he said. "Especially those paid with kindness." Samuel reached forward slowly and wrapped trembling fingers around the polished wood. The crutch felt lighter than his old one. Stronger too. Balanced perfectly for his height. Somebody had spent many hours shaping it by hand. The realization hit harder than he expected. Nobody in Red Hollow had ever built something for him before. Not because they cared. A strange tightness rose in Samuel's chest as he tested his weight against the new crutch. It held firm immediately. Steady. Reliable. For the first time in years, standing did not hurt quite as much. The riders nearby noticed too because several of them exchanged faint approving smiles. Samuel looked down quickly, embarrassed by the attention. Nantan stepped closer then did something nobody in town expected. He placed his fist gently against his own chest before lowering his head toward Samuel in quiet respect. One by one, the riders behind him repeated the gesture. 200 men. Silent. Honoring a crippled stable boy the town had mocked only hours earlier. Sheriff Price removed his hat first. Then the blacksmith. Then even a few men outside the saloon followed slowly after them. Nobody told them to. The moment simply demanded it. Samuel stood frozen in the middle of the street holding the carved crutch while winter sunlight reflected softly against the turquoise beads. He had spent his whole life believing he was invisible. But standing there beneath the open sky, surrounded by silence deeper than words, Samuel Whitaker finally understood something the town never had. A man did not become valuable because powerful people noticed him. Sometimes he was valuable long before anybody learned how to see it. By sunset, the snow along Red Hollow streets had turned to thin ribbons of muddy water reflecting gold beneath the fading sky. The Apache riders remained only a little longer after the silence settled over town. No threats were spoken. No weapons drawn. They did not need any of that. Their presence alone had already changed something inside the people watching from porches and windows. Samuel Whitaker stood beside Martha Bell's barn with the carved crutch resting beneath his arm while cold evening wind moved softly through the valley. The polished wood still did not feel real in his hands. Across the street, Clyde Mercer quietly nailed a broken board back onto the saloon porch without speaking to anyone. The loudest man in town had become the quietest before sundown. Sheriff Nolan Price walked slowly toward Samuel with his hat held awkwardly against his chest. He looked older somehow than he had that morning. "Samuel," he said carefully, "I reckon I owe you an apology." Samuel glanced toward the mountains glowing red beyond town. "For what part?" he asked softly. The sheriff lowered his eyes. "For standing there while folks treated you poorly. For pretending I did not see it. Samuel studied the tired man for a long moment before answering. Most people see it, he said quietly. They just decide staying comfortable matters more. The word settled heavily between them. Sheriff Price nodded once because he knew the boy was right. Nearby, Takoda prepared his horse while several riders tightened saddle straps and checked supplies for the long journey north. Nantan approached Samuel carrying a folded wool blanket beneath one arm. The same dark blue color as winter dusk. For the cold nights, he explained. Samuel touched the fabric gently. Thick. Warm. Handmade. You already gave me too much, he said. Nantan shook his head. You gave me my life first. The young Apache hesitated before reaching into his coat and pulling out a small silver object wrapped in leather cord. Samuel recognized it immediately. The dented tin cup from the barn 3 winters ago. Cleaned now. Polished bright enough to catch the evening light. My grandfather kept this after I told him the story, Nantan said softly. He said ordinary things become sacred once kindness touches them. Samuel took the cup carefully, emotion tightening his throat too deeply for words. He remembered that freezing night perfectly now. The storm. The fear in the boy's eyes. The way the little cup shook between his hands while snow hammered the barn roof overhead. At the time, Samuel thought he had done something small. Nothing important. But standing there now beneath the western sky, he finally understood how far one act of mercy could travel through another person's life. Takoda mounted his horse slowly and looked down at Samuel one final time. There is always a place for you among my people, the old chief said. Not because of debt. Because a good heart should never stand alone. Samuel lowered his eyes, overwhelmed by the offer. Nobody in Red Hollow had ever spoken to him like he belonged anywhere at all. The riders began turning their horses toward the northern trail. Snow crunched softly beneath hooves while evening shadows stretched longer across the valley floor. Before leaving, Nantan rode back one last time and stopped beside Samuel near the barn fence. You asked me once why I trusted you, he said quietly. Samuel frowned faintly. I did. Nantan smiled. The night of the storm. He looked toward the town behind them where curtains still shifted in dark windows. I trusted you because wounded people recognize kindness faster than anyone else. Then he rode away.